We were looking at the original Phillips curve, which assumes anchored inflation expectations, i.e., inflation expectations are anchored to some value, which is the value around which inflation varies from year to year. So expected inflation is constant. Right, so this is the assumption the original Phillips curve makes that inflation expectations are anchored, and under this assumption, the original Phillips curve shows a trade-off between inflation rate and unemployment rate. So the key thing to remember is the original Phillips curve assumes anchored inflation expectations, i.e., expected inflation rate is constant, which is this, and this constant is the value around which inflation varies from year to year. We want to now discuss why the original Phillips curve broke down. Now, the idea is this: economists were able to use the old version, the original version of the Phillips curve successfully throughout the 1960s. The reason behind this is that originally inflation was not persistent and thus it was independent of last year's inflation rate. When you have such an environment where inflation is stable, so it's reasonable that wage setters can just ignore past inflation and expect that regardless of what inflation was last year, inflation this year is simply equal to the pi bar, right? The value around which inflation varies from year to year, right? So when you have an environment where inflation is stable, it's not persistent, so it's independent of last year's inflation. So in that case, it's reasonable that as a wage setter, you will just ignore past inflation and in particular expect that regardless of whatever inflation was last year, inflation this year is simply going to be equal to pi bar, which is the value around which inflation varies from year to year. So expectation of inflation was roughly constant, and thus it was rightly given by pi t is equal to pi bar. So in that case, you did have the assumption of anchored inflation expectations holding, and thus you had a trade-off between unemployment rate and inflation rate. Because when we talked about the original Phillips curve over there, we did discuss that this is a reasonable assumption, right? That anchored inflation expectations is a reasonable assumption as long as as long as inflation is stable, as then it's reasonable for workers and firms to just ignore past inflation and assume a constant value of inflation. And this was true till the late 1960s, that inflation was stable, it was not persistent. So wage setters, when forming inflation expectations, just ignored last year's inflation and assumed expected inflation was just equal to pi bar. So they formed the expectation of inflation around a fixed number, the value around which inflation varied from year to year. So we had anchored inflation expectations, which gave us the original Phillips curve as a trade-off between inflation rate and unemployment rate. But the original Phillips curve relation disappeared, or as some economists have remarked, broke down in the 1970s, where we did not see any visible relation between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. So the key thing to remember over here is that during the 1960s, we did see the original Phillips curve in the data because at that point inflation was stable, it was not persistent, so it was reasonable for wage setters to just ignore past inflation and form expectation around a fixed number. So we had anchored inflation expectations, where we know by anchored inflation expectations, we just simply mean expectations are anchored around some value, which is the value around which inflation varies from year to year. Right, so under that, we had the original Phillips curve as a trade-off between inflation rate and unemployment rate, but this relation broke down in the 1970s. We can see in this figure, it shows the combination of the inflation rate and unemployment rate in the US for each year from 1970 to 1995. And we can see the points are scattered in a roughly symmetric cloud. We can't see any visible relation. We can't see the negative trade-off that we earlier saw between inflation rate and unemployment. If we go back, during the 1960s, we saw this trade-off, right, between inflation rate and unemployment, where lower unemployment is associated with higher inflation and higher unemployment was associated with lower inflation. But during the 1970s, there's no such visible relation here. The points are just scattered in some symmetric, roughly symmetric cloud, right? You don't have this negative visible trade-off. Now, this brings us to why did the relationship break down in the 1960s? Again, it's important for here to go back to why did the relationship work to begin with? It worked. The reason people had these anchored inflation expectations were formed around this fixed number because inflation was stable, it was not persistent. So it was reasonable for you to ignore past inflation. This is what we discussed here also, that this anchored inflation expectation assumption is reasonable as long as inflation is stable, it's not persistent. So then it's reasonable that you ignore past inflation. So what happened during the 1970s was there were two reasons why the relationship broke down. The first was that US was hit twice in the 70s by a large increase in oil price. So this results in an increase in markup M in our Phillips curve equation, and the increase in markup M because of the increase in oil price leads to higher inflation rate even at a given unemployment rate. So even for the same unemployment rate, because of the increase in oil price, markup went up, which increased the inflation rate. So even for the same unemployment rate, now you have higher inflation. But the more important reason why the relationship broke down in the 1970s is that wage setters changed the way they form inflation expectations. During the 1960s, we know the way they formed inflation expectations was that they just ignored past inflation. Because inflation was stable, it was not persistent, you just ignored it and formed your expectation around a fixed number. What happened during the 1970s, however, was they changed the way they form inflation expectations, and this change came from a change in the behavior of inflation. Because remember, how you form inflation expectation depends upon the behavior of inflation. Like over here, we said anchored inflation expectations is only reasonable if inflation is stable, it's not persistent. So what happened was in the 1970s, and they changed the way they formed inflation expectations, which came from a change in the behavior of inflation. The rate of inflation became more and more persistent. High inflation in one year became more likely to be followed by high inflation in the next year. So as a result, people changed the way they formed inflation expectations, where they now started to take into account this persistence of inflation, that if inflation is high in one year, it's likely to be higher in the next year. They started assuming that if inflation had been high last year, it was likely to be high this year as well. So now instead of assuming instead of just forming expectations around a fixed number pi bar, they started adopting pi t is equal to pi t minus 1, where they started to take into account the persistence of inflation. So the old Phillips curve failed to match the data. Expectations that had been anchored, i.e. roughly constant around a number, became de-anchored. They became unanchored from a particular value. That's why the relationship broke down. Because remember, when we talked about the original Phillips curve and we talked about it assumes anchored inflation expectations, i.e. expectations are formed around some fixed number, they're anchored at some value. That is only a reasonable assumption as long as inflation is stable and not persistent. So the main reason the original Phillips curve broke down in the 1970s and we did not see the negative trade-off we earlier saw in the 1960s here, which we did not see here, was because of the change in the behavior of inflation, which led workers to change the way they form inflation expectations. Inflation was no longer stable, it started becoming more and more persistent. So workers started to now take into account this persistence when forming inflation expectations, where they assume that if inflation had been high last year, it will be high this year as well. Right, so now they adopted pi t is equal to pi t minus 1. So the old Phillips curve failed to match the data. Expectations that had been anchored, I roughly constant, became de-anchored. Because when we talked about the Phillips curve, we said the goal is to derive a relationship between inflation rate and unemployment rate. And we said this depends upon how wage setters form expectations of inflation, which in turn depends very much on the behavior of inflation. So the original Phillips curve says there's a trade-off between inflation rate and unemployment, with under the assumption that inflation expectations are anchored, and that assumption only holds the assumption of anchored inflation expectations only holds if inflation is stable and not persistent, because then it's reasonable for you to ignore past inflation. But that's why the original Phillips curve broke down in the 1970s, that inflation was no longer stable, it became persistent. Workers started to take into account that persistence. So they now, instead of assuming pi t is pi bar, they started assuming pi t is pi t minus 1. Expectations were no longer formed around a fixed number. They took into account the persistence of inflation. So now the original Phillips curve broke down because of this.